It was a calm, quiet morning in the small town. I was walking down the road, heading to the market when I saw him. The old farmer. He was hunched over, his back bowed with age, hands weathered from years of hard work. He was standing near his farm, leaning on a simple wooden cane. His clothes were plain, just faded jeans and a worn-out shirt. Nothing about him stood out. He was the type of person you'd pass by without a second thought. But there was something about him that made me stop for a second. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit his face, or the way he moved so slowly, like he had all the time in the world. Or maybe it was the fact that everyone seemed to ignore him. As I walked by, I couldn't help but notice a group of young men leaning against a fence nearby. They were laughing, their voices loud and full of mockery. I glanced over, and that's when I realized who they were laughing at. The old farmer. I don't know what they were saying exactly, but I could see it in their faces, the smirks, the way they whispered behind their hands. They didn't even try to hide it. It was cruel, and I couldn't believe how easily they mocked him. But the old farmer didn't react. He just stood there, looking at the ground, like he hadn't even heard them. I felt a pang in my chest, but I kept walking. After all, what could I do? He was old, they were young. He had probably gotten used to it by now. What they didn't know, though, was that this wasn't just any quiet old farmer. He wasn't just some helpless man to be laughed at. The next day, I was running some errands when I noticed the same group of guys gathered near the market. They were talking loudly, just like yesterday, but something was different this time. The mood wasn't as carefree. Their usual arrogance seemed to have been replaced with a sense of unease. They kept glancing over at the road where the old farmer had passed by earlier. I couldn't help but overhear their conversation as I walked past. "Man, I can't believe he just stood there like that. Didn't even say anything back." One of them laughed, clearly still thinking about the old farmer from the day before. Another one added, "He looked so weak, man. Didn't even care we were laughing at him. I bet he didn't even know how to defend himself." They all chuckled, but there was an awkwardness to it now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just me, but it didn't seem like they were enjoying it as much as they had the day before. That's when I saw him. The old farmer was walking down the street, his cane tapping softly against the ground. He had a different look in his eyes this time, calm but intense. He walked past the group of young men without even a glance. I noticed the way they all went quiet as he passed, like something had changed in that moment. Then, just as the old man reached the end of the road, one of the guys, the loudest one, the one who'd been mocking him the most, shouted, "Hey, old man, how about you fight back for once? Are you too old to care?" For a moment, there was silence. The old farmer stopped walking. He didn't turn around, but I could see his shoulders tense. Then, without saying a word, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out something, and held it up. It was a medal. The young man froze, his face falling. The others stared, their laughter dying in their throats. The old farmer didn't need to say anything. He just held the medal up and let it hang there in the air, glinting in the sunlight. The silence stretched on for a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The group of young men just stood there, looking at the medal in the old farmer's hand. It was small, nothing flashy, but there was something about it that made the air feel thick. Finally, the loudest one, the one who had been mocking him, took a hesitant step forward. His confidence was gone, replaced by something like nervous curiosity. What's that?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. The old man didn't look at him, didn't even blink. He just held the medal there, letting the young man's words hang in the air. The others were still standing motionless, unsure what to do or say. I could see it now. The medal wasn't just some trinket. It was a military medal, old and worn, but unmistakable. It had been earned in battle, in war, somewhere far from this quiet town. The young man, who had been so full of mockery just moments before, seemed to shrink under the weight of it. His shoulders slumped, and the smirk he'd been wearing vanished. What's this supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice shaky now. The old man finally turned to face him, his eyes steady and unyielding. "It means you should learn some respect," he said, his voice deep, rough, but calm. There was a pause, and then the young man took a step back, as if suddenly aware of the mistake he'd made. The others looked at each other, some shifting nervously, others staring at the ground, not meeting the old man's gaze. The farmer didn't say anything else. He just turned and started walking again, slowly but steadily. His cane tapping with each step, his back straight now, not bent by age or mockery. The group of young men stood there in stunned silence, watching him go. I watched too, feeling the tension in the air finally start to lift. They had no idea who they had just mocked. They had no idea the quiet old man they thought was weak had lived a life they could never imagine. The next few days were strangely quiet. I saw the group of young men around the town, but something had changed. They no longer had the same cocky swagger in their step, and they kept their distance from the old farmer. It was as if they had all suddenly learned something about themselves, though none of them would admit it. But it wasn't until a week later that the real twist came. I was in the market again when I saw one of the young men from the group walking toward the old farmer's farm. He was alone this time, and there was no mocking smirk on his face, just a nervous sort of look as he approached the old man, who was out in his field, quietly tending to his crops. The young man stopped a few feet away from him. He hesitated, looking like he was trying to figure out how to speak. After a moment, he finally spoke up, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it before. "Hey, old man?" he started, the words coming out more hesitant than he probably intended. The old farmer looked up from his work, but didn't respond immediately. He simply studied the young man with those steady eyes of his. The young man cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, but pressed on. I'm sorry, man, for what I said that day. We were wrong. I didn't know." The old farmer didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at the young man like he was sizing him up. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a small nod. "I know," he said simply, his voice calm but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Then, he turned back to his work, the conversation over. But the young man didn't leave. He stood there for a while, not moving, like he was trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, he spoke again, this time with a bit more confidence. "I've heard things, he said, "about your past, what you really did." The old farmer stopped working, and for the first time I saw his expression change, just a little. His face softened, but only for a moment. He looked at the young man again, but this time, there was something different in his eyes, a kind of understanding. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear," the old man said, his voice almost too soft to be heard. "But I'll tell you one thing. I've seen things in my life that most people can't even imagine, and I've learned that silence is sometimes louder than anything else." The young man stood there, processing the words. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked down, his expression thoughtful. Then, in a quiet voice, he muttered, "Thank you, for not letting us get away with it." And just like that, he turned and left the old farmer's farm, a little wiser, a little more humble. A few weeks went by, and I didn't see much of the young man or his friends around the town. It was like they had all gone through a change, one that I couldn't quite explain but could feel in the way they carried themselves. They no longer laughed or mocked the old farmer. They kept their distance, but I could tell that something had shifted within them. It was early one morning when I learned the final piece of the story. I was in town, sitting at a little cafe by the side of the road, sipping on my coffee, when I saw a couple of familiar faces. The group of young men. But this time, they weren't laughing. They were standing by the farmer's land, talking to someone. At first, I couldn't make out who it was, but then I saw him clearly. The old man. And in a strange twist, they weren't avoiding him. They weren't embarrassed or mocking him. Instead, they were listening. The young man who had apologized a few days before was there, standing next to the farmer. He seemed to be showing the others something. Probably the metal that had started all of this. Curious, I stood up and walked closer to see what was going on. As I approached, I overheard the conversation. The young man was speaking with a newfound respect. "I think it's time we finally show the town who you really are. You deserve that much," he said to the old farmer. The old man just nodded, not saying much in return, but I could see the way his face softened. It wasn't about pride for him, I realized. It was about something deeper, something more profound. The farmer wasn't seeking attention. but he had earned it in a way none of us could have imagined. And that's when I realized the full weight of it. The old farmer had been a hero, not just in the past, but in the present too. The quiet, unassuming life he led now didn't take away from the man he had been. He had served his country, fought battles, and seen horrors that the young men could never truly understand. And yet, he had never asked for anything in return. The young man, still standing beside him, was trying to convince the others to honor him properly. "We can do something big," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "We can show everyone what he did for us. He deserves to be remembered. He deserves to be respected." And just like that, the respect that had been so absent before began to grow. The group of young men who had once mocked him were now standing by his side, ready to make things right. I left the cafe quietly, my heart a little heavier but also a little lighter, knowing that the old farmer, the man who had endured so much, was finally getting the recognition he deserved. Not because he wanted it, but because the truth had finally come to light. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story and found something meaningful in it. If you did, please take a moment to like, comment, and share. It helps so much in spreading the love. And if you're not already subscribed, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any future stories. Your support means everything to me and keeps me going. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of change.